Welcome to this exciting episode of Black Beat Podcast, where I'm your host, John Washington, editor-in-chief, CEO of Flossin Media, and I'm joined by my brilliant co-hosts, Fawn Aberson and Michelle Darr Carrera, managing editor and senior editor for Flossin Media.
Today we have the distinct
honor to meet you all.
Thank you.
And today we have the distinct honor of welcoming Dr. Jill Stein, the Green Party's candidate for President of the United States. Dr. Stein is a dedicated advocate for a future that prioritizes people, planet, and peace. With a career spanning decades in environmental health and political activism, she brings a vision for America that challenges the status quo and pushes for systemic change. Her platform calls for a just transition to a green economy, healthcare as a human right, and an end to perpetual war. We are here to discuss how her policies will directly impact Black communities across the nation.
Hey, Doc. Well, welcome, Dr. Stein. It's a pleasure to meet you again, and welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, John.
Yes.
Great to be with you.
Well, what's this thing about the three P's now? Your three P's. Planet, peace,
and people.
And people. Tell us a little bit about how that came into being and what's that all about for you, Dr. Stein?
So, by profession and education, I'm a healthcare provider. And, very early on, I kind of saw the obvious, which is that your health isn't just what goes on in your healthcare office, your nurses or your doctor's office. That's really important, and everybody has a right, should have a right to healthcare for everyone. That should be for free in my book, and most developed nations all provide this healthcare as a human right for everybody, and it's paid for through a progressive tax base. But at the point of service, you don't have to pay up because there are so many people who can't pay up. And the way the healthcare system is run, is just not working at all. But at any rate, that's like one fundamental. We all need healthcare. But what happens before you get to your healthcare provider is really what's driving the show here. Do you have lead in your water? Are you breathing polluted air? Are you in a food desert? Do you have dilapidated, disinvested housing and stuff like that? So at any rate, I got involved in kind of the community basis of our health. And there I found that so often our elected officials are working with their big donors, the real estate industry, the coal companies, that are polluting the air, the big pharma that's charging outrageous prices, So at any rate, I began to see that there were just certain common issues that we can get divided into the many causes, the many battles we have to fight, but they all kind of come together in a big way. And, there's sort of people issues, there's social justice issues about our lives, there are planet issues about our food, our water, our air. And then there are issues of peace, which are huge. They're often like not right in front of our faces. But the reality is that half of our congressional budget is going to this endless war machine, which is conducting one major catastrophic war after another that's not making us safer, that's not making the world a more peaceful or just place. And we're seeing this big time now. The average family, the average household is spending $12,000 this year on basically the money that's going into the endless war machine. What could you really be doing with that $12,000 other than kind of blowing up many areas of the world, which is what's going on here. So calling it people, planet, and peace. And there's another part of this too, which we don't always say, which is that's people, planet, and peace over profit.
Oh, good one.
Our world should be about us. It should not be about making money for the big pharma and the insurance companies and the real estate developers. But that's what drives policy. We know that from lots of studies. We know that from fights in our communities. It's really the money that goes into lobbying and campaign contributions that buys policies. And everyday people are left with what we've got, which is not working. 63% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. Half of everybody who rents their housing is about one paycheck away from losing their housing, from being evicted. Evictions and homelessness are sky high. So many Americans are locked into student debt. Young people do the thing they're told to do, go build your skills, go get some education after high school, and then they're saddled with these huge debts. And our Congress, when the economy crashed in 2008, they spent trillions bailing out the big banks and Wall Street crooks that crashed the economy. We should have been bailing out homeowners. We should have been bailing out the students locked into debt. We can just do so much better. Right now, most people's lives are in crisis, especially our young people that really don't have a future. And half of young people describe themselves as hopeless about the future. So, it's not working. And, People, Planet, and Peace is about how we get together and look at the big picture, and we come together around the big picture. Because if we're divided into many issues, we can never get critical mass to make things change. So People, Planet, and Peace over profit, is kind of a way of envisioning how we can, create a world that works for all of us. In Martin Luther King's world, or in his words, this is about the beloved community. This is about working together for a world of justice, rather than being what he described as, my country is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. And he really understood that, this gigantic war machine is destroying us at home as well as around the world.
God,
Yeah,
Dr. Jill,
exactly.
I am, you opened up so much. You got me so excited now. And I take it your background is in behavioral health. The service,
Which is internal medicine.
Internal medicine, so that certainly includes behavior.
Yeah. Okay.
Sure
Because
does.
when I heard that and thought about that, I kept asking myself, God, I wonder what she thinks about what's going on.
Well,
in DC right now with what we're left with, the platform that we're left with, the two contenders that you're up against, is that when you look at that, and I don't want to get too far in advance.
John,
yeah,
actually,
she wants to unpack that a little bit more.
Right. So let's go into your background, Dr. Stein. We were looking at your page, your studies in college. I think John was alluding to it at Harvard,
Yes.
where you graduated magna cum laude.
Wow.
Where I think it said you
Very
studied
impressive.
sociology, psychology, and anthropology.
Wow.
Which,
Right.
right?
That's quite a package, Doc.
And then, of course, you went to medical school. So I think, John, your question was a good one. Considering your background and your education, the question you really are trying to unfold, John, is what does she think about the behavior of
what we're dealing with right now, and
In the-
former president
in the election cycle or
Right,
in the
right. Just the
leadership
whole-
cycle?
Yeah, just the whole dynamic that's happening right now and around the presidential campaign.
Yeah, I think he wants
and
to
the
know,
contenders.
what do you think about the behavior of the two dominant party candidates?
Well, I would say the candidates and also their parties, because, and that's not to say everybody in their parties, but, the candidates are serving an agenda of their parties. And that agenda is very much decided by their big donors. And, these are big money candidates. In the case of Trump, he has a lot of money himself, but he also collects a lot of money. And if you look at where the money is really coming from in their parties and in their campaigns, it's coming from the billionaires. It's coming in super PACs where, people can contribute. He just got a $50 million contribution. $50 million contribution to Trump's campaign, and both parties use these loopholes so that they can accept huge donations. So they both work with super PACs that have no limit, and it enables billionaires basically to buy their way, and buy the policies that they want. But they also, they have these other loopholes, like a donor can write a check for $600,000 and direct it to Trump or Biden, and then it kind of gets laundered. It goes to state parties, then it comes back to them, basically. It's called victory funds. That's just one of many loopholes whereby big money is buying our democracy. And if our democracy is bought, it's not a democracy at all. And so we get these crazy candidates who have, their skill is in serving their big donors. Their skill is also in fundraising. from big donors. It's an incredible corrupt system, legally corrupt, but this is the way it works. And there's a great quote from a Supreme Court justice from the prior century, Louis Brandeis, who said that we can have either a democracy or vast concentrations of wealth. We have such concentrated wealth in this country, it buys its way, into politics. So we're not making progress. We're actually going in the wrong direction. We're going in reverse. Money is getting more and more concentrated. The extremes of wealth are worse. The bottom 50% has 2% of wealth. If you look at the African American community, it's something like 1/10, $1 for the average African American household compared to, $10 worth of wealth. The disparities are so locked into the system, and it's not getting better. It's getting worse. To me, it's crazy. It's a psychopathic kind of system where people who suppress their humanity and they're just going for the money. It's like a cult of wealth, which denies our humanity, denies our communities. It brings out the worst in us. And we're having a world now which is not going to survive for very long. If you look at where we're going in terms of our wars, our climate, crushing inequality, it's not working. We are making a beeline right now for oblivion. This is not working for everyday people. And I want to just quote two people. One is Frederick Douglass, who said, "Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has and it never will." That's why we have to step outside of the system and stop playing footsie with it, because it's not playing nice with us. It gives us lip service. And by us, I mean, people on the margins, which includes everyday working people, who are surviving paycheck to paycheck right now, basically hand to mouth, more and more people. So that was one thing, Frederick Douglass, who said that if we're going to move the system, we have to stand up and be heard. We can't just play nice or ask nicely. It doesn't move unless you build power to make it move. And then there's Alice Walker, the poet and the novelist, who said that the biggest way people give up power is by not knowing we have it to start with. And her point is that when you put us together, people who are struggling to keep a roof over their heads, 44 million young people and not so young people who are struggling to get out of student debt, 100 million Americans who are locked into medical debt, practically as many who don't have adequate health care or health insurance, and like 60 some percent, according to Reuters poll, that don't want this genocide in Gaza. Don't want it at all, want an immediate ceasefire and want a diplomatic solution. That's a lot of people. When you add them up, that's more than enough to win an election. So the point that Alice Walker makes is that we got to work together. And when we work together, we actually do have the power. We do have the critical mass to win any election if we stand up with the courage of our convictions.
Yeah. Doctor, you've been at this for a while, looking back at some of your numbers since 2016 and probably back, but have you ever in your history of watching the politics of America devolve itself to such a standard of who do you believe, me or your lying eyes? I mean, is there anything, have you ever seen anything like this before? I mean, sometimes I watch it and I begin to feel if I got some mental health disorders or something, did I not hear what I just heard? Or these kind of dynamics. Have you ever seen these kind of dynamics in politics before? I mean, to where people could outright just lie and be okay? And especially in this level of politics in the chief seat. Have you ever seen these types of dynamics or these characteristics in the human behavior before in these kinds of settings?
So I think we've seen lots of people lie, and I grew up in the Vietnam War, which was also based on a lie and, continued based on a lie, so we've certainly seen them lie, but they never lie kind of like, and admit that they're lying, and admit that they lie, cheat, and steal, and they do that now. They admit it without shame and without remorse. You don't see Biden doing that. You certainly see Trump doing that.
Yeah.
It's kind of like a cult of the Republicans, but remember what Malcolm X said, I think, and I'm paraphrasing him, but he said he would rather deal with a wolf that's outright lying and it's lying. No, he didn't put it that way. I think he said it's better to deal with a real threat that tells you, they're going to attack you. He would rather deal with that than with the fox that pretends it's going along, but it's actually not.
Right.
And it's secretly planning to attack you. And I sort of feel like that's our choice. Do we want a blatant, shameless attack, or do we want a covert attack? And in my view, we don't have to accept either of those possibilities. We need elected officials who are on our side, and who are honest and who are not being paid to be, paid political advertisements for their big corporate donors who they're actually serving, not us. So I share with you this sense of like absolute disgust at what our political system is. And I think, it's really important to see it all the way through, not only what it says, but also what it does. And it's treacherous, I think, across the board.
What keeps you in the game, Dr. Stein?
Oh,
What keeps you in the game?
well, I mean, I can tell you in one word. Well, it's a little more than one word, but I got into this game as a community advocate, as someone who is working at the community level, fighting for healthcare or to close down a polluting coal plant or for jobs and stuff like that. And then I got into politics because I saw that's not working, when the system is working against us. Anyhow, I got tricked into running for office for the first time in the year 2002. That was the first time I had anything to do with actually being a candidate. And I had nothing to do with politics until Ralph Nader in 2000. When I heard him, it was like, oh my God, someone who's like really speaking my language, telling the truth and talking about what we need as the public. But I didn't have anything to do with like being a candidate until 2002, when I got tricked into running for office by the Green Party, who said they kind of agreed with the agenda that I was working on. Why didn't I move that agenda into an election and be able to talk to more people about it? And I thought, well, nothing else is working. Might as well, descend to that degraded level of politics and see what happens. One of the things that happened was that we fought our way into a debate, a televised debate. And in that debate, I talked about our usual agenda of ending environmental racism, racial justice, environmental justice, healthcare as a human right, ending student debt, free public higher education, cutting the military, and spending our dollars on things we need here at home. That's what I said in the debate. The debate didn't have an audience. It was just in a TV studio. And nobody responded to my agenda. Went over like a lead balloon. Nobody bothered even to rebut it. But when we walked out, I got mobbed by the press, who told me that I had won the debate on the instant online viewer poll, which we didn't even know was going on. And it's like at that moment, I had this revelation. Oh my God, it's not true that the public doesn't get it. The public does get it. They just never have a chance to hear, that they have an option, which is actually about justice and humanity and, and sustainability. They never get to hear it, or peace. And at that moment, I realized, oh, so the hardest part of this is already done. People have already been persuaded by their lives, by being thrown under the bus. Most people are not holding these illusions that these war parties are going to solve this for it. Most people don't hold those illusions. They just don't know that there's a choice. How do we let them know that there's a choice? That's not easy when the media has been kind of consolidated, taken over by corporations. It's very hard to get the word out and to organize, and they've got all the money. It's hard, but it's not impossible. It's way easier than changing people's minds. And at that point, I kind of realized what Alice Walker said, which is that the biggest way we give up power is by not knowing we have it in the first place. We can potentially have the power. So once I realized we don't have to change people's minds, we just have to figure out how we organize around this very oppressive system. that just gave me a whole lot of hope. And I believe nothing that I hear from, the organs of mainstream propaganda. I just don't let it get to me, and I don't believe it. So when you're an activist, and you're surrounded by other activists, the world is a hopeful place. And so I don't have to talk myself into feeling hopeful. And one last thing is that, to my mind, the issue is not hope so much as power. It's about power. It's about recognizing that we have power, and that if we work together, we can build power which is unstoppable. We essentially do have the power to change this, but we have to, rearrange a few things, adopt a few strategies. We got to make some tweaks to the system, but we basically do have that power. So that's what keeps me in this. It's like a game of Tetris or some other like addictive game. It's like, what's the next move we have to make in order to realize our power?
Yes, and how do you believe that we activate that power in the public? What's it going to take to have people look at you and other third-party candidates as viable? Because that's the number one thing I hear. Not that people don't agree with you, but that they don't think that you can possibly win this fight, that the fight is already predetermined, and they're right in a lot of ways. But how do you address that? How do you activate that?
It's a very steep playing field, for sure. And in my mind, it's not impossible at all. And if I just look at the progress that we've made since my first race in 2012, we've come light years. So our agenda, the agenda of healthcare as a human right, of housing, affordable housing as a human right, with public housing and rent control, everywhere. The right to education with a floor for all schools that's good. So you're not dependent on the property tax, but the federal government is bringing everyone up to quality levels, ending student debt, cutting the military and putting our resources here at home. This agenda, the Green New Deal, it was unheard of. It's all been launched by Greens, and our agenda has been absorbed. It's given lip service. It's often not served, but it's given lip service. So just by being in the fight and by speaking out, we have changed the agenda. We move the needle. We begin to create what's possible. And let me say the other thing here is that, I don't know if you've heard the phrase, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you.
Yes, exactly. I was thinking of
Yeah,
that.
did they
Then you're
appreciate
When they
it?
went
That is
after you
true.
over
Yes.
Russia, that's exactly.
And that very much tracks our progress, because we're now at the point where they're fighting us big time. They announced months ago that they'd be hiring an army of lawyers to try to throw us off the ballot. They've never felt like they had to do that before, but they're doing that now. They're taking us to court all over the country to throw us off the ballot because they are quaking in their boots. They're terrified that we should get heard. This is why they lock us out of the debates. They're afraid that what will happen is what happened back in 2002 when we got into the televised debate and we won the debate. People will resonate with what we have to say because we're not bought and paid for, and people can smell a rat, and they can also smell if you're not a rat. So the powers that be are terrified that their days are numbered. Their days are numbered. And whether we win in this race or we continue to make progress, that's what counts. And by running at the national level, we also help encourage people to run with this agenda at the state and local level. And we've had over 1,000 office holders at the local level. You never hear about them. You hear about the Green parties. Oh, they run for president every 4 years. That's not true. We actually have people who are in office. This year they also made the mistake of publicly advertising for infiltrators. They'll pay you $65,000 a year to infiltrate our party and our ballot drives and all that. We have the evidence now.
Oh my God, you
Wow.
have the evidence of that? Where is that evidence coming from?
Where is it? We got it off of public job advertising. We got it off of job postings.
So we
Wow.
now have that.
Just like
it's
that.
coming
They can
from
just
the
go out and
DNC,
post like that out in the
who
open.
hires,
Oh my God.
There's no
basically hires
law
to
against
infiltrate
that,
our
huh?
campaigns and to infiltrate our party.
Is there a
So-
law against that?
What's that?
Is that illegal?
I don't think so. No, because we've taken them to court for similar dirty tricks in our petition drives. And let me tell you about one of them in North Carolina. For our Senate race in 2022, Matt Ho, a terrific former serviceman in Iraq and Afghanistan who ran for Senate as an anti-war candidate. So you have to collect signatures. He collected all the signatures, way more than he needed. And then the Democratic Party impersonated the Green Party, and they called people whose names were on the petition, because you can get a copy of the petitions. They called people who had signed the petition and pretended to be the Green Party, saying, we're the Green Party. We've decided we no longer want to run this candidate because we're afraid he might spoil the election. So would you please take your name off the petition? Well, they happened to call the co-chair of the party, the co-chair of the Green Party in North Carolina, who recorded the phone call. And that phone call was taken to court in an effort to get our candidate back on the ballot because they got him thrown off through these dirty tricks. And this is like what they do. They are afraid. They are running scared, which is why they go to the trouble of all this corruption and these dirty tricks in order to knock us off the ballot. They did, and they were fined. Not nearly as much as they should have been, not nearly enough to cover the legal costs, but they were fined like $6,000 and were basically convicted of this so-called operating with dirty hands. It should have been outright fraud. I mean, why is that not fraud when we talk about, social media memes that have nothing to do with the election as election manipulation? How is that not election manipulation? So the system is quite corrupted, and a large part of that corruption is the behavior of the parties. So they are running scared against us now, and they resort to these ridiculous, outrageous, dirty tricks, which include locking us out of debates, because voters have a right to vote and we have a right to know who we're voting for. So this is why I encourage everybody to go to our website, jillstein2024.com, and sign up for our newsletter, find out about what's going on, and participate in the ballot drives, because the ballot drives give us more choices. We are the only anti-war, anti-genocide, climate emergency, pro-worker, and pro-reparations, I might say, candidate.
You might
Only
say. I'm
such
hoping you're
campaign.
saying. No,
What's
I'm
that?
glad you're saying that part of the reparations part. But thinking about that, didn't you have something to say about politics?
Well, a couple of things, Dr. Stein, about the voting, right? So in the last presidential elections cycle, we had the highest voter turnout in the history of the 21st century. It was nearly 155 million people came out to vote. That was 66% of the eligible voters. We were talking, that still leaves 30 some percent that isn't voting. Could you speak, what would you say to the voters who are not voting, who could potentially be third-party voters and really equal the playing field here or narrow the gaps? What would you say to folks who aren't, I mean, especially in this election year, we are not happy with the Democratic or the Republican candidates. Many people are very unhappy with who is going to be elected. So what can you do now as a third-party candidate to speak to those folks who historically do not vote because they're not interested?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think that is the name of the game, is speaking to those communities, going to those communities, connecting with those communities. And, we are all about doing that. Right now, our focus is getting on the ballot so that we can actually be a choice. But once the worst of these ballot drives is behind us, we will be going full bore. And, in 2016, it was about 100 million people who came out to vote. So it was way less, and I think kind of fear of Trump was really ginned up, in the last election to get a bigger turnout. But when your turnout is based on fear, it's very hard to sustain participation. You really have to generate turnout based on like, what's the candidate going to do for you? Not like, how are they going to be less worse than a disaster? How will they be less of a disaster? That's just not much of a sustainable connection. And I think it's all about getting out, connecting with disenfranchised communities, because that's who's not voting. The characteristics of the non-voter are lower income, of color, and younger. And this is typically the more progressive demographic as well. These are people who really desperately want change and need change. So it's all about getting to them. And, it's community by community. It's attending, the church meetings, the festivals, it's getting on the social media networks and all that. It's getting on programs like this one, that are are specifically addressing the communities that are really hurting. This is where it happens, letting people know that you do have the power. If we stand up, we can really impact our lives. Right now there's such a propaganda campaign to make people feel hopeless so that they won't
Yeah, this whole
participate.
notion around apathy politics. Yeah,
Or the
Exactly.
notion that we don't
and
have
we have
any
to
power.
challenge that.
yeah.
Yeah, so I know, Michelle, we had been talking before this interview, Dr. Stein, about voter suppression, about open primaries. We'd been really looking at, some of these races when you look at the Republicans or the Democrats and who's voting for in the primaries. It's like, it's such a ridiculously low number compared to
yeah.
the state population who are choosing our candidates for president. And then the general population gets to, choose from their selections, and it just seems very unfair with that and other voter suppression occurrences.
Absolutely.
What can you speak to that a little bit?
For sure. I mean, look at New York State that held their primary maybe 2 or 3 months ago. Their turnout went down by 83%. That is more than 4 out of 5 voters stayed home. With the same candidate, Joe Biden, who had already been coronated in this election and in 2020, when the New York primary was held, the race had already basically anointed him already. But everybody came out in 2020 because they were engaged. Now they're really horrified, and they feel like their voices have been suppressed. Exactly as you say, their voices have been silenced in this election. So people feel like they don't have buy-in at all because it's not their choice. Why should they get out in the general? Because people were very clear. They wanted other choices in their primary. And it speaks volumes about the Democratic Party that they would not allow other choices. Other people were really marginalized. There were other competitors, and they were basically sidelined and not allowed. And often they were kept off the ballot. There was just a whole machine behind coronating Joe Biden again, which was terrible, especially in light of all the doubts about his competence and his very poor performance. So the parties, they like to blame their failure on third parties and candidates like me. But if you want to see the most spoiled election that was the worst outcome in modern history, there were no third parties at all. This was in 2010 in the midterm elections following the Wall Street crash of 2008, when the Democratic trifecta, 2 houses of Congress and the White House, all Democrats, decided they were going to bail out Wall Street, much against public opinion, instead of bailing out homeowners who were thrown out by the millions. So what happened in the next election? The Democrats lost 1,000 seats in state legislatures. They lost 64 seats in Congress, and they lost some 13 or 14 seats in the Senate and the same number of governorships. That tells you right there what's going on. The party has abandoned its base, so the base has walked away. That's what the essential problem is. And the Democrats won't talk about that because they're owned by their donors, and they don't want to move differently whatsoever. They are just going for the big donors, and they give lip service to everyday people, to the African-American community, to women. They give lip service, forever. They were saying their first priority would be women's reproductive rights, and they would codify Roe. And they didn't do it for about 40 years, even when they had a supermajority in the Congress to do it. They refused to do it. So the Democrats, they said they would create a public option for healthcare. They never did that. All they did was pour more subsidies into this private system, which is not serving everyday people, is completely unsustainable, and so many people cannot afford to go to the doctor or to get their prescriptions filled. So their talk.
Those last 2 hits, because you said the first about Roe. So give me some thoughts about that a little bit, and then I'd like you to take it out to the border for me and talk a little bit about the border issue. Okay, so those 2 topics, I really am interested in hearing your view on Roe and this whole issue of rights that these parties have been seeming to dismantle as they've been going along here. So talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I mean, women have a right to reproductive health care. It should be built into our healthcare system, and decisions should be between women and men, for that matter. Regardless of gender identity, those decisions should be between that person and their healthcare provider. It's not where the state should be interfering. And, you know, the Democrats have promised forever that they would codify Roe, and they refused to do it. Even Joe Biden had a majority in Congress initially with which he could have changed the rules, the 2/3 requirement that could have been altered to have allowed legislation, you know, sort of healthcare legislation to be passed with simple majorities. The Republicans have made changes like that for judicial appointments, for example. They modified the 2/3 rule for the Senate. The Democrats had the majority to modify that 2/3 rule when they held the Senate. So it could have been done under Biden. Biden promised it was the first thing he was going to do. He never did it. Same thing with Obama. He also promised that this would be the first thing that he would do, and he never did it. And he had, you know, for 2 years, he had a 2/3 majority where it could have been done. Remember that we legalized abortion through the Supreme Court, through basically action in the streets under a very conservative Supreme Court and with a very conservative president under Richard Nixon. It was the power of the women's movement at that time, which was just determined to keep pushing on this, and they did. So, you know, we can do the same, and we should. And this would be, you know, high up in our agenda, obviously, as part of passing healthcare as a human right under an improved Medicare for all system. We would include full reproductive health care. Nancy Pelosi has forever said, oh, I don't know about abortion. I don't think that's a useful issue for us. So you've had a lot of push and pull within the Democratic Party. It's always been a great fundraising issue for them, but they have never actually stood up and defended that right. And we need to do that. Poor women, for example, you know, are locked out of abortions in Medicaid, and that also has been supported by Democrats as that legislation has been renewed over decades. So, you know, we need to insist on this, on healthcare as a human right, which must include reproductive health care as part of a comprehensive, you know, system of ensuring that we are alive and well and healthy and in control of our reproductive destinies.
Yeah, I'm good. And that's a great response, Doctor. You know, tell me a little bit, what's your thoughts a little bit about our southern border and that whole debacle going on down there?
Instead of throwing billions of dollars into walls, which do not keep people out, they just force people to go through more dangerous routes and result in more deaths. We should be investing in the human infrastructure to properly process people. But let me say, first of all, the most important thing we can do to address the immigration crisis is to stop causing it in the first place by destabilizing countries south of the border, by overturning their governments, as we continue to do, by sowing just the seeds of chaos, by enforcing corporate agendas across the world, including in Haiti, you know, where we have overthrown Haiti's government, you know, forever, many times, including Aristide, who we overthrew twice, in order to basically allow U.S. corporations to have cheap labor and to continue making cheap products. When after the overthrow of Aristide, Haiti passed a referendum to raise their minimum wage to something like 65 cents an hour, approximately. I may not have that number exactly right, but it was unbelievably low. And this is what they were raising it to. And Hillary Clinton came in and led the State Department in overturning that referendum in order to basically support big corporate profits for the clothing manufacturers that relied on cheap labor in Haiti. And that's an example of what's been, you know, what's been driving our policies south of the border and the kinds of chaos and misery that it has created. Add to that our drug policies, for example, and the war on drugs, the so-called war on drugs, which creates this black market for drugs, which is the most dangerous thing and the violence that also is driving many people out of their countries. So by legalizing marijuana, for example, cannabis, which we should do in order to get rid of the drug cartels, we need to start by legalizing marijuana and then move to a system that treats substance use as a public health problem, not as a criminal problem. That's how we get a handle on, for example, the 100,000 people who die every year from opioid overdose in this country, but it's also how we get a handle on the violence that's driving much of the migrant problem. So just to make that make that point for the southern border, we need to implement policies which we can implement fairly quickly to reduce the chaos and misery south of the border that's driving the migrant crisis. That's one thing that we have to do. Another thing that we need to do is provide the human infrastructure, not walls, but asylum lawyers, immigration lawyers, people who are doing the processing, who are screening people who come in so that they can be quickly provided their papers and they can go to work. This is not about locking people out. This is about enabling people to take jobs, which for the most part, other people are not going to take. And we know that actually migrants pay their own way and more. They pay their taxes, and they pay a lot in taxes. And this actually is a boon to our economy. The numbers around this say something like I shouldn't quote it because I don't remember the numbers exactly, but it's huge. A huge boon to our economy if we can actually allow the migrants who are coming to flee the chaos that we created. So we sort of owe them relief. We owe them asylum. To the extent we can end the chaos, that's preferred. People do not want to leave their families and their communities. At least no one that I've talked to wanted to come here unless there was absolute desperation that they were fleeing. We need to enable people to stay in their countries of origin and be contributing members of society and the economy where they are and remain part of their communities and their families. But to the extent that people need to come here, we need to provide the civil society structure, not impose this as burdens on individual communities. This is all work that should be done at the border. People need to be processed, papered, and then allowed to come to work where they are very much needed.
Thank you, Dr. Stein. We have about 10 minutes left and we still have two more topics that we want to talk about. Michelle, I think you wanted to bring up the Palestine and Israel.
Right. I wanted to know more about what your strategy and plan is for activating those, people in the Democratic Party and without, who are just so disgusted and disaffected by this open, blatant genocide and what Israel's been doing for 75 years.
Exactly. And so, to cut to the chase here, this crisis did not start on October 7th. October 7th was just the latest in a back and forth. And it's been an accelerating back and forth. Well, I shouldn't say that. It's been kind of an up and down because it started off with a terror campaign, in 1948. And this only came to light recently with these disclosures of the historical records of the National Archives of Israel that showed that, in fact, there was a plan to use terror to displace the Palestinians and to make room for the Zionists. Prior to the Zionists, Jews, Christians, and Muslims lived together in peace. And those communities got along very well. And when the Zionists came, they drove them all out, not just Muslims. They also drove out the very super Orthodox Jews and the Christians as well. They were at war with all of them, and they were all victims of the Nakba. And there were thousands of people that were killed early on. There were something like 500 villages that were destroyed, and there was about 750,000 people who were ethnically cleansed and, have been living in refugee camps ever since. So this has a long, tragic history. And you can go back even before the Zionists, when the Jews were the victims of, genocide themselves. And I grew up in a Jewish family right after the Holocaust. So this was a very big issue. How do you deal with, being, victims of genocide? And our generation dealt with that by resolving that we would never let genocide happen again, not to anyone. So, it's been quite for many Jews and others. This is just an intolerable assault on our collective humanity.
To see
Right.
this
And
genocide
how do
being
you feel,
practiced.
since you brought that up, how do you feel about Judaism being conflated with Zionism?
Oh, terrible. To my mind, that is the most anti-Semitic thing possible. To conflate Judaism with Zionism, because Zionism is conducting a genocide right now. And to say that Jews are okay, or to say it's anti-Semitic, because this is often what you hear, it's anti-Semitic to object to Zionism. If you're criticizing Israel or Zionists, you're anti-Semitic. To my mind, that is an anti-Semitic statement, because it implies that Jews are okay with genocide and Jews are okay with ethnic cleansing. And to me, that's the biggest insult of all. And, I think it really does raise the specter of huge anti-Semitism, because so many people now have this just gut-wrenching reaction when we hear the name Israel. And we think about, the murders of children that we're seeing on an industrial scale every day. And, Israel is really cooking its own goose here, and now talking about attacking Lebanon. Lebanon is supposed to be the next Gaza. That's what they're actually talking about now. They're going to tone it down in Gaza, and they're going to direct their fire at Lebanon. Oh, great. And then we're going to be at war with Hezbollah and with Iran. And
what would you, if you were elected president, what would you do? What would you
I
do?
would follow the law. I would follow US law, which says that it is illegal to provide weapons to a country that is violating human rights, that is interfering with the delivery of humanitarian aid, and which is violating nuclear weapons treaties. And Israel is guilty on all three counts. They are violating the non-proliferation treaty by having nuclear weapons. So on all three counts, we should not be providing them with weapons. That's when we're going to see things change. And Joe Biden has the power to do that right now, just like Dwight Eisenhower did in the 1960s, to rein in Israel, to make a phone call, and then the war stops. Or Ronald Reagan did the same thing in the 1980s. So this is a piece of cake. It just requires responsible leadership that supports American values, that supports where the American people have said they stand on this issue. Joe Biden or the president, whoever that is, has the power to implement that in the blink of an eye. So that's how we can do this. Unfortunately, Biden's not going to do it unless we force him to. And that's why I really encourage people to support our ballot drive. Again, go to jillstein2024.com. Support our ballot drive. We're on the ballot right now for a majority of voters, but we want to be on for every voter to the extent that it's possible to do that. And so this is a people-powered campaign. We need people power, because getting on the ballot tells Joe Biden that we are coming and we are not going to allow this genocide. And in fact, he is risking also being declared a genocide criminal, conducting genocide by the International Court of Justice. I'm sorry, the International Criminal Court, which has so accused Netanyahu and Israel's and Hamas's leadership. But the U.S. is a full partner here with Israel, and by all means, we could be accused as well. So Joe Biden needs to take that to heart and end this genocide now.
Yeah, I mean, it's heartbreaking for all of us who are watching the news, and we're probably not even seeing the real tragedy of it all either. So it's been really tough.
You do if you watch the live streams.
Oh, well, yeah, live streams as American citizens to, feel helpless about this. Dr. Stein, and as we close out, I'm going to let John close out and Michelle make some things too, but I'm wondering, are you having a hard time getting mainstream media to listen to? Are you getting on mainstream media platforms, CNN, Fox? Are you being invited to those?
So we got on CNN once, and and I was allowed to talk about Israel and Zionism, and that was it. And we've been on News Nation a couple times, but that's it. There's a blanket blackout. This is why it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. These polls, they don't mention your name, and you're blacked out of the media to start with, so how do voters ever know? It's a self-reinforcing system right now that's designed to lock out anything except the political establishment, which is driving us over a cliff,
You
which
know,
is why
Mr.
so
Stein,
important for us to stand
I
up.
fully understand.
Like
As a former clinician myself, I'm sitting here listening to you speak, and I ask myself, where has this element been in the overall scope of for the people by the people? This whole notion, and as I speak, you went in my heart because I think the compassion that we need to have for humanity, that's part of it. But when you listen to political platforms and those kinds of conversations, always the human element is left out of that dialogue and that discussion. So I feel so left out in my experience, and it doesn't necessarily have to always evolve to an emotional state of consciousness. Even as I'm listening to you, you make sense. And maybe that's why you're not invited to some of these platforms, because they don't want to make sense. They just want to make money, And so, listen, Doctor, I am so gracious to have touched your spirit in this conversation with you today. You have enlightened me. You've have awakened my consciousness for politics in a different way. And I do appreciate you coming on to Flossin Media at this point in time in your career and in this day. And sister, I am honored to have you on this show.
Well, it's been such an honor to be with you, John, and with your esteemed colleagues. It's really been wonderful. I can't praise you enough for what you're doing, because it is the real media, the real journalists like yourself who are informing and empowering, the American public to actually be a democracy. Without you, we are not a democracy. So thank you for spreading the word, and I hope we talk again before too long.
I second that notion, and this concludes this episode of Black Beat Podcast. But I'll tell you, stay tuned. And for y'all out there feeling a bite on your heel, Dr. Jill Stein is coming. Careful, sister. It's a pleasure meeting you, and good luck with the race. You hear? Power to the people,
Thank you
right?
so much.
Go on with your bad self.
Thank you.